to a very timely topic. Is this too loud? Am I a little loud? Can somebody adjust for me, or I think help is on the way. But if you don't hear, raise your hand and we'll try to adjust in that direction. I'll step back a little bit here. Timely topic. Let me tell you up front, I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 5 years, but I know exactly what's going to happen in 10 years. And I'll get to that by the end of the talk. So I'm going to tell you very briefly, even though some of you may have heard this story, about how I got involved in television, because it's actually historically relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight. About a month before I was to graduate from medical school in the spring of 1969, I went down to the student lounge to watch the evening news. That night, it was the Huntley-Brinkley report. Gray hairs in the audience will remember. It just so happened that on that evening newscast, they carried a report from Chicago, where that day the AMA had held a press conference to announce their opposition to the proposed appointment of a Dr. John Knowles, then head of the Mass General Hospital here in Boston, to become Undersecretary of Health. The reason the AMA was opposing him is because he was advocating something called universal health care. 1969, folks. And had they held auditions, the AMA, to find the worst possible spokesperson for their cause, they couldn't have done better than an ancient trustee who read a statement, and then when the press started asking him questions, he discombobulated so quickly and so badly that handlers had to lead him off the stage. And when they came back to Huntley and Brinkley, they were literally laughing so hard they had to go to a commercial break to regain their composure. The next morning, in my mailbox, by pure coincidence, obviously, was a form letter from the AMA inviting me, as an about-to-be new doctor, to join the AMA. Form letter that went to all people who were going to graduate that spring. And on pure impulse, I took the letter and wrote with a pen or pencil something like, "If what I saw on the evening news last night is any indication of your policy, I do not care to join. Thank you." And dropped it in the mailbox, never expecting to hear another word. And to my utter astonishment, got a long personal letter from the then head of the AMA, the executive director, outlining their opposition to Dr. Knowles. And it sounded a little bizarre to me, so now I was kind of into it. I sent the letter off to Dr. Knowles in Boston, never met, and we became pen pals. And when I finally ended up here in Boston, we became friends as a result of that past correspondence. And that was just at the moment, literally, when a group of Harvard people, including Dr. Knowles, was taking over the operation of Channel 5 in 1972. And they were going to do a little program on health for the public, and John asked me if I would host it, kind of talked me into trying it for a month. And so I'd go in there and do that for a half an hour in the morning and then go to the hospital the rest of the day. And that's how I got started in television, over the topic of universal health care. Still very much in the news. Now, for roughly the first half of my time at ABC, I was very much and entirely really focused on clinical developments, new tests, treatments, etc. But in the early 1990s, something happened that just kind of woke me up about the fact that healthcare policy could be every bit as important as new clinical developments in determining the health status of people in this country. And here's how it happened. It was during the days of the debate about Hillary care. You all remember that. And one night, Peter Jennings, then the anchor of World News and a good friend, said to me, "Tim, I want you to do a report on World News, 4 minutes I'll give you, to compare the US and Canadian healthcare systems." And I protested that couldn't possibly do that in 4 minutes. But his standard answer always was, "Oh, you'll figure out a way." And in fact, we did. We did something that turned out to be very illuminating for me personally. We called the Family Practice Organization in the state of New York and the similar organization just over the border in the province of Ontario. And we said, pick a 2-doctor family practice that we can come and visit, interview, and find out how it works. And then once they gave us those names, we called the practices in each place and said, pick a young family with 2 kids that we can interview. really not knowing what we were going to find or get into. We went to Springdale, New York, just south of Buffalo. 2 young family doctors, wonderful physicians, very dedicated, compassionate. And we very quickly found out that they had the equivalent of almost 3 full-time people in the office doing nothing but filling out different insurance forms. That was an eye-opener for me. More people than the actual doctors, number of doctors in the office, just doing insurance forms. I think they had 26 or 7 different forms at the time. The family they picked was a young family, a self-employed logger, father, made a little bit too much money, so they didn't qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to buy health insurance. And we looked at their budget. Everything went to food and shelter and clothing. And they had an 8-month-old child. So I said to the father, what happened when you went into the hospital with no health insurance? And he said to me, I sat in the business office for about an hour and a half while my wife was in labor and negotiated a 5-year payment plan. It was kind of shocking to me, to be honest. I just hadn't kind of thought about that before in that way. So now we go across the border into the province of Ontario. 2 young family doctors, again, lovely people, in this case 2 women. So I asked them about the billing, and they couldn't even understand the question. So when I explained what happened in New York, she said to me, oh, we have a woman who comes in 10 hours a week and does our billing because it's the same form for everybody. It's a single payer system, single form. And the family that they had picked also had a young child. Don't remember the exact age, but under a year old. So I asked the father, of course, about what happened when he went into the hospital. And again, I had to explain what happened to the father in New York, and he said, oh no, he said, when my wife went into labor, we just went to the hospital and showed them our card that everybody gets when they're born in Canada. And then he said, and I'll never forget these words, he said, they whisked us upstairs. And I came away from that trip thinking, maybe we've got something to learn from other countries. Maybe there are better ways to do things in healthcare. And that got me thinking about this subject for the first time, really, in any emotionally meaningful way. And since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, reading about it, interviewing experts. And I'm going to try to share with you very briefly tonight my own personal opinions on the matter. And you'll have plenty of chance to shout back and disagree. All healthcare experts agree that the 3 main problems facing U.S. healthcare and healthcare in all developed countries are cost control, quality assurance, and affordable access. Cost, quality, and access. So anytime you hear people talking about a new idea for healthcare or a new proposal, or you hear the politicians speaking about it, ask yourselves, what is this going to do for cost, quality, and access? And that's a way of kind of measuring these various ideas and proposals. Let me say a word about each of them. Cost. A lot of numbers floating around, but here are a few really important ones. And you've probably all heard these already or read them. But we Americans now spend about $10,000 per person on healthcare every year. $10,000 per person. That'll add up to about $3.2 or $3 trillion this year, 17-18% of our GDP. That's about twice as much as the average per person cost in all other developed countries if you lump them together and average them. So if you take them all, Japan, Germany, France, England, lump them together, the average per person cost is about $5,000 to $6,000. Twice as much. Now, if we lived twice as long or had twice as good results, I guess you could justify that, but of course we don't, as you all know. Our life expectancy is a little less than the average of developed countries, and our outcomes are certainly no better, and in some cases not as good. So the question is, why do we spend so much? And that's a complicated question, as you might imagine. Spend all night just talking about that. But the big picture would say that there are 2 driving forces that push American healthcare costs up. On the one hand are the expectations of all of us as American healthcare consumers. We Americans have been raised at the altar of dramatic science, and so we have come to believe that the newest is automatically the best and what we should have. Don't you kind of feel that way if you're honest with yourself? And on the other hand, you have the so-called medical industrial complex. That's a phrase that Arnold Relman, then editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, first used in, I think it was 1989, that pours out new products, new tests, new devices, new treatments constantly. And so you put those two things together, the belief that the newest is the best and a constant stream of newest, and you've got healthcare costs that keep going up. So if you just look at that, it's fairly discouraging because it doesn't seem to provide any real answer in terms of what to do about cost. But there's another number that's always worth thinking about. Most healthcare economists suggest, estimate, guess, that about a third of what we spend on healthcare in this country is, and the word they usually use, unnecessary, meaning that there's no real proof that it makes any difference in the outcomes. And I'll tell you again, when my eyes were opened on that account, again in the 1990s, some of you may remember that in the early 1990s, leading experts in the breast cancer treatment field in this country started to promote the use of bone marrow transplant for advanced breast cancer. And these were top people, big names. So we in the media interviewed them, gave them a platform, and very predictably, women with advanced breast cancer and their families started demanding this treatment. Why wouldn't they? Sounded like it would be good for them, might be better for them. This went on for about 5 or 6 years until 1999 at the annual cancer meetings, the so-called ASCO meetings. There were 3 studies presented that showed definitively that bone marrow treatment for advanced breast cancer, was no better than the standard chemotherapy then available. But by that time, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 women had been treated that way at a high cost in terms of both money and risk. We do that all the time in this country. We develop new products, new tests, new ideas, and we promote them. They're in the media, headlines, catch our attention, without really studying them thoroughly to first find out whether or not they're any better than what we already have and whether or not they're safe in comparison to what we already have. So that means that if we could figure out how to identify that third of $3.3 trillion, we'd have over $1 trillion we could save theoretically, right? So why don't we do it? Well, all kinds of reasons. One is it's not that easy to identify for sure what might be, quote, unnecessary. We all have an inkling of some things that happen in our own lives, our kids' lives, that we think are unnecessary. A lot of brain scans, CT scans are done unnecessarily just because of a minor headache, for example. But identifying them for sure is not an easy matter. It requires study. But just as importantly, this unnecessary spending translates into real people with real jobs who contribute to our economy, who pay taxes. What politician wants to do reform that's going to result in the loss of jobs among his or her constituents? It's a tricky business. So to really do that thoughtfully and carefully requires the cooperation of true experts in the field and politicians who are willing to work and study this subject over a long period of time. And we don't have that kind of political system, do we, currently? It's just not feasible that we can do that. So the question is, what's going to happen with healthcare costs down the road? Currently, healthcare costs, most years in the past 2 to 3 decades, have been twice the general inflation rate. Healthcare costs this way, general inflation. You can't keep going that way forever without catastrophe. So sooner or later, and I'll come back to this, we'll have to figure out what to do about that problem. Let me talk secondly about quality. We are privileged in this country, and certainly in this city, in this area, to have the very best health care available anywhere in the world at our fingertips. And most major cities, all major cities in this country could say that. But we also have a lot of places in this country where you probably wouldn't want your animals treated, and everything in between. And you compare that to another industry, and it's quite startling, and I'm going to do that right now. So, the Institute of Medicine, a highly regarded impartial body that studies these kinds of issues, quite a few years ago now, estimated that 98,000 Americans die every year from medical errors. Now, most of the time we don't even hear about them or know about them. They happen behind closed doors, behind gold curtains. But that estimate suggests that there is a real problem with standardized safety and quality in healthcare in many parts of this country. And again, I want to compare that to another industry, another life and death industry, the airline industry, where the safety record is phenomenal. You can't even remember the last time there was a commercial airline crash in this country, probably. I think it was 2009, an airliner in Buffalo, New York. But the airline industry has this phenomenal safety record in comparison to the healthcare industry. Why is that? Well, again, complicated, a lot of issues involved, but one of the reasons is that in the airline industry, the federal government lays down the law in terms of safety, in terms of how often airplanes have to be inspected, how often pilots have to be recertified. Aren't you glad when you fly that we don't leave that up to each state to decide? I mean, think about that for a minute. How would you like to be in Anchorage, Alaska, Biloxi, Mississippi, wherever, and look out the window and think, I wonder what the state laws are about these planes and these pilots? There's something to be said for federal standards in certain industries for certain reasons, and I'll come back to that again. But we have a quality issue with healthcare in this country. Again, the very best, no question. My wife had a kidney transplant a year ago at the Mass General. I saw it firsthand. But you can't count on that everywhere and every place. Finally, let me say, again, a very brief word about access. So, President George W. Bush, during one of his campaigns, made the famous statement that we have universal health care in this country because, quote, anybody can go to the emergency room, quote. And there's some absolute truth to that. The emergency rooms of our country are really the courts of last resort. And when people can't go anywhere else, when they don't know where to go, when they don't have insurance, that's where they go. But as we all know, that's a terribly costly and inefficient way to deliver health care in terms of primary care, especially, of course. So the question is, why don't we have what every other developed country in the world has in one form or another, universal health insurance, which makes all the difference in terms of access. If you have insurance, you are empowered to seek help when you think you're sick. If you don't have health insurance, the data shows pretty clearly you tend to hesitate, you tend to wait for all kinds of reasons. You're embarrassed, you don't know how you're going to pay for the visit or the medications that might be prescribed, etc. And the result is that we spend a lot of money in this country on health care that could be delivered much more effectively and efficiently if people had early access with some form of health insurance. Now, if we decided as a society that we're going to let people die in the streets, we could save a lot of money. And I say that, and it sounds terribly harsh and cynical, and of course it is, and it should be. And God forbid that ever happens in this country. But the point I'm trying to make is, if we're going to take care of these people anyway, these people being the ones without insurance, and we are, as a society, through the emergency room, if necessary, and finally, why don't we try to figure out how to do that more effectively and more efficiently with health insurance available to people so they get into care earlier. I often use the example of a chest cold. If any of us with good health insurance or Medicare develops a chest cold and it's bad, we go to the doctor, clinic, and if it's bacterial, we'll get some antibiotics and it'll be over in a week. People without health insurance tend not to go at that point. They wait, and then they get really sick. They develop pulmonary failure, and they end up in the emergency room, and they're admitted to the ICU, and it's a $300,000 bill. So I keep hammering at this point because I think it's really non-political. It's financially sensible, which is if we're not going to let people die in the street, if we're going to ultimately take care of everybody, let's try to figure out how to do it in the best possible way. Now, a little terminology. Is healthcare a right or a privilege? I should take a vote maybe, but I won't, about where you all stand on that issue. Hotly debated issue everywhere. So, to me, healthcare fits into the category of a basic right. I compare it to police protection and fire protection. In fact, I often refer to it as health protection. It seems to me, this is my opinion, that it is one of those basic rights that we need and deserve as human beings in a country that can afford it. In contrast, I think privilege is owning a car, a home, big TV. That's a very different ballgame. But it seems to me that health protection, health care, is vital to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and should be thought of in that category. So I'm one who advocates health care in the category of being a basic right. There's some other terminology that often gets batted around. For example, is health care a free market commodity, or is it a government-regulated service, or something in between? So commodities, like cars, are very much a part of the free market. And it works because the consumer can become informed, can go in and argue about the price and the offering, and if they don't like it, they can walk out the door, basically. The consumer is king in the commodity market, the so-called free market. It's not that way in healthcare. It's very hard for most people to become fully informed about what's happening, to know what the price and quality and process is going to be, especially if it's an emergency room issue. You're not going to walk out the door because you don't like the price or the process that's going on. We're very much at the mercy of the system. And therefore, you have to think of healthcare, I think, in a very different way. And the whole idea that you can simply turn it into the so-called free market and everything will be fine, I think is ultimately not correct. Other terminology that often we encounter involves the issue of socialized medicine and single payer and government control. It's always important to remember that healthcare always involves two basic issues: the financing, that is, how do you collect the money and disperse it, pay for the service, and the delivery, how is the service organized and delivered. So Britain is the classic example of true socialized medicine because the government does both. They do the financing, but they also own and operate the hospitals. That's socialized medicine. Canada is a hybrid, half and half. The government, through the provinces, does the financing, but people can choose their own doctors and hospitals. And we can get back to that a little bit later. So it's half and half. And we, of course, have the same system in this country in the form of Medicare. Medicare is a classic example of the hybrid system. The government does the financing, classic Medicare. We choose our doctors and hospitals. As it turns out, every developed country in the world has figured out how to cover all their citizens with some form of health insurance by figuring out how to combine those two in a way that is controlled by and regulated by the federal government. So let me give you an example. Germany, the biggest capitalist country in Europe, has a system where they still have private insurance companies. They call them sickness funds, about 170, I think. But the government regulates these companies in terms of what they can charge. They regulate the cost, and they regulate the quality and the access. So these companies compete with each other on the basis of service. So you sign up for an insurance company, and after a year, every year, you can say, well, I like them, I'll stay with them, or I didn't like them, I'll choose another one. So there's real competition at the level of service, but very tight control by the government. And that's true, as I said, of every other developed country in one way or another. So we've got problems with cost, quality, and access. And we really don't have a so-called healthcare system in this country in terms of a national system. What we have is a hodgepodge of private and public programs with a lot of cracks. So 30 million people are still uninsured in this country. They fall between those cracks for many different reasons. In contrast, again, every other developed country has figured out a national system that in one way or another makes it clear how every citizen can gain access to health insurance. So, what do I think is going to happen in this country? The past 6 months have been quite a ride, haven't they? In terms of just observing the political scene, quite astounding. But I think it makes quite clear that we do not have in place a political system that can deal in thoughtful, rational, long-term planning ways with these kinds of issues. So my prediction is that the costs are going to keep going up year after year, and that in about 10 years, give or take a few years, either way, the costs will reach a point of national crisis. As George Stephanopoulos once said to me when we were talking about this a few years ago, we'll reach a point where we can't sell our bonds on the international marketplace. And that's bankruptcy, in essence. And at that point, I do believe that the federal government will have an emergency meeting in Washington, sort of like the banking crisis. Remember how that happened? People saw that coming, but nothing happened until they literally faced a true crisis financially. And they will either go to a single-payer system, Medicare for all, to get the pipeline in one place to figure out how to control costs, or more likely, given our history, they will go to a hybrid system where they will preserve the private insurance industry of this country, which is a very powerful industry, but, and this is a huge but, under the tight control of federal regulation in terms of cost and quality and access. I truly believe this will happen, not out of the goodness of our hearts, not out of the wisdom of our politicians, not out of the largesse of the private industry, but out of sheer economic necessity, which is the way often things happen in this country in terms of big social issues. I wish I could stand up here and tell you I think it could happen differently, and it will happen differently, but that's my honest personal opinion about what we're facing given these problems and the kinds of issues we face on healthcare in this country. Well, that's enough to give you a pain between the ears. I don't mean to prolong this. So I'd like to open it up and give you the chance to answer questions, ask questions, make comments, go at me. We should have a healthy dialogue.
Let's see, is this where yes, this is working? Or start off with her. Okay, in my view, what you said is right. The one thing I think you didn't get quite right is that you need the political will in order to do what you want to do. In this country, politicians have political careers. They need to keep getting reelected, which means they have to keep raising money.
Yeah.
And the money comes from people with vested interests and lobbies.
Right.
How do you get rid of that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the basic issue is the financing of our campaigns. The healthcare industry spent about $3.7 billion in lobbying since the turn of the century. They are a hugely powerful lobby. And for example, when Obama tried to put in the so-called public option under his plan, the insurance industry killed that very quickly because they knew they couldn't compete with that. Their overhead is, depending on how you look at it, anywhere between 20 and 30%. The overhead of a single payer system in terms of just pure administrative costs is about 1 to 3%. So, there's no comparison in terms of the cost effectiveness at the administrative overhead level. So I totally agree with you. And that's why I think it's going to take a financial crisis to overcome their lobbying power, to put it in very simple terms. Back here and then in front.
How did Canada manage to get control of the insurance companies when the United States is not able to do that?
I don't know the answer to that, and I'll have to look it up. It goes way back, of course. Canada and most European countries have grown up with a culture of so-called social solidarity, where they have kind of built-in culture that arises from birth in terms of a sense of we're all in this together and we've got to figure out how to do it together. The U.S. has a history of rugged individualism. We're a much bigger, more complicated country, to be fair, both geographically and culturally. It's a much more difficult task than other developed countries have faced. That's why I think it's going to take a real crisis for us to do that. But I'm going to go look that up when I get home tonight, see what the exact history of it. And I suspect it occurred province by province and then became a national program. Now, I think most of you know that employer-based health insurance, which still covers the majority of Americans, about 155 million Americans, is an accident of history in this country. Post-World War II, the government imposed price controls. Labor controls. What's the word I'm looking for? Wage controls. And so companies, they were allowed to compete for employees by offering benefits, and they started offering health insurance, and that's how it happened. Most other countries are not tied to an employer-based system, and it's much easier to deal with for that reason. Yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that in the countries that we tout that have all these good health care, the amount of money is taken out of people's salary automatically the way we do Social Security.
And Medicare.
And Medicare. And I'm assuming that if a person is unemployed in many of these countries, that the government just picking up the rest of the cost. I mean, we talk about all this wonderful, Milk for Mothers, right, or all the healthcare programs in France, but somebody's paying for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There is always going to be a segment of the population that will be carried by the federal government in terms of cost. But they have concluded that in the long run, it works better that way, and it's cheaper in the long run than letting people go without health care until they reach a crisis point. And by the way, just to get it out of the way, there's no question that in Canada and many other developed countries, people wait a lot longer for procedures. No question. So the trade-off is the security of knowing that when you really need it, you'll get it. We Americans don't like to wait for anything. We want health care right on our own corner with free parking and appointment this afternoon, right? Very different national psyche.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
In recent years, it looks like hospitals have solved the problem by merging. The elixir of corporate America is bigger is better. You have all kinds of economies of scale, and it's great. I'm not sure that's true. It hasn't usually worked in corporate America. The other question I have, the last failed Republican effort, one of the sponsors was a doctor.
Yes.
How do you explain that?
Well, I don't know that individual personally. I really don't know much about his political stance. I know he's a Republican. Many physicians, older physicians in particular, still defend the system where they can charge whatever they want. And they don't like to see changes that eliminates that possibility for them. So I'm assuming he may be in that category, although I shouldn't say because I don't know about him personally. But I wouldn't count on older physicians to be leaders in enlightenment in healthcare reform. I don't think that's where it's going to come from. And the organized physician groups, I mean, the AMA today is very much in support of the kind of ideas I've been talking about tonight, in contrast to what I talked about in 1969. But they don't represent physicians much anymore. It's the specialty groups that have the power now in the lobbying in Washington. And they defend their turf, as any good union does. And it's going to be a crisis that will overcome those kinds of oppositions, nothing else, I think. The mergers, so the idea is not only economies of efficiency, but more negotiating power. But it hasn't quite worked out that way for them. They're all struggling. Even Partners, the big, very wealthy healthcare system, is for the first time in their career as a system, struggling with healthcare costs for all kinds of reasons. The insurers are driving hard bargains, employers are demanding hard bargains with the providers increasingly. I mean, those of you on Medicare, aren't you astounded when you see the bill, what was submitted, and then what was negotiated, and therefore what you have to pay, fortunately much less than it would have been. So these are hard negotiations, and there's so many issues here, but one of the issues that comes up is if we negotiate with these healthcare entities so successfully, we could kill innovation. I mean, there could literally reach a point where there wouldn't be money to do the kind of research and innovation that we very much appreciate in this country. So we're going to have to figure out how to balance all those kinds of issues. But the most important thing that we have to do in the future is figure out what is truly cost-effective care and pay for that, and not pay for care that is not effective. So you're all reading the articles about these new cancer drugs that are $100,000 a year, $150,000 for an extra 4 to 6 months of life, maybe. Folks, we can't afford that on a large scale. On the other hand, you may have read about the new drugs for hepatitis C that also cost $100,000 a year. We should pay for that because it's a cure. It saves money in the long run. So we have to do that kind of analysis. What is truly cost effective? Pay for that and not pay for the rest. And that's a process that will take a long time to unfold, and it'll only be driven by a financial crisis, in my judgment.
So speaking of the future, I have to ask a question about initiatives that institutions like LaSalle can undertake to produce scholars who are well-rounded and who can actually speak to and provide meaningful...
Who's speaking? I can't tell who.
I am. I'm sorry.
Oh, where? Oh, there you are. Okay, thank you. Yes. I heard the voice, but I couldn't see the person.
I guess I'll start over. My name is Monica Hall Porter, and I'm a professor, assistant professor of biology here at LaSalle. And so my question is more pointed toward curricular goals.
Yeah.
How can we produce scholars who are well-rounded and who can actually be the future in making decisions and being informed citizens about how they should approach and tackle this problem with healthcare?
Boy, that's a complicated question, and I'm no expert on it, but I'll just make some random observations. Typically, it's not going to be people who are heavily invested in a scientific career. That's just not a part of their horizon or their thinking. Although sometimes these people become very adept at healthcare policy for various reasons. But there is a whole cadre of healthcare policy experts now in this country. And there are many, many excellent programs to train people in these issues. But the question is, will they have the political power to affect change? That's always going to be the question. And so far they haven't. There's no lack of knowledge about our problems and possible solutions. That's not the issue. The issue is how to get those into and affirmed by and put in place by the political system. And that's why I think it's, personally, I keep coming back to the fact that I think it's going to take a real financial crisis before that can happen. I wish it could be otherwise, but given what we see now, at least, I don't see how it can be.
A little story that supports what you're saying is that I asked Congressman Kennedy, who was our congressman for this area, a question about a segment of that problem. As one who oversees a retirement community, and people who are fortunate enough to be able to pay for it. There's a whole segment of the large segment of the population who has difficulty, finding where to go when they get to that stage of life. And right now, they go to Medicaid facilities. But as that population of elders grow, and it's going to be a tsunami of people who reach those ages pretty soon, how is the country going to deal with that? Japan and China have already had that problem, and they're parking people in high rises and things, and it's not a pretty picture. And I asked Congressman Kennedy, only the federal government can really deal with that problem. How and he gave the same answer that Dr. Johnson's getting is Congress isn't going to do anything about it until after it becomes a crisis.
Really? Sad to hear.
He wasn't happy about it. This is an important issue for him, but the way he sees it, there's no will, there's no movement to tackle that issue because it's a big financial challenge to tackle it until it becomes a crisis, or even a little bit beyond a crisis.
And part of the challenge would be to identify the people who are going to be displaced by reform and retrain them to do things that are needed in the healthcare system. And that, again, takes political will and planning that we don't have right now. But hopefully we can do that at some point when the crisis forces us.
If it relieved the employers of paying for it, isn't that a big...
Oh, you mean, well, sure. So
if it became something like a single payer or a...
I'm not talking about the employers paying for health insurance. I'm talking about employees in the healthcare system. I mean, it is the most robust segment in our economy right now, healthcare. And again, no politician wants to interrupt that, deal with job loss or job displacement. So you have to have planning for these people who will inevitably be affected by true reform. That's all I'm saying.
And I was asking about whether the reduction in costs, if that reduced
Yeah.
the contributions the companies had to pay, they'd have a lot more money available to invest in growth and do things and to pay for new employees.
So theoretically, if we went to Medicare for all overnight, which of course is impossible logistically, but if you do, our taxes are going to go way up, but we would not be paying healthcare premiums, and the people who have tried to take a preliminary look at that trade-off say we'd come out ahead. Even if we pay more taxes, we won't be paying premiums. So theoretically, that could be, but that's way beyond my pay grade in terms of data. Yes?
Older people are worried about the rationing
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
medical services. How do you,
Older people worried about the rationing of medical services. A very legitimate question. Right now, of course, we tend to ration healthcare in this country based on your ability to pay and your ability to know how to use the system. But theoretically, so I'll make a statement like this and see how you react. No developed country will be able to do everything for everyone at every age that modern science might dream up. Think about that. I think that's true, but I have no idea if it really is because I can't predict the future. Which is to say, I think we're going to have to do some rationing, but hopefully it can be done on a rational basis rather than the irrational way we now have rationing. So one of the most interesting things that's happening right now, how many of you read Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal? A lot of you. Great book, isn't it? And doesn't it get you thinking about this very issue? So when I was a medical student and resident, families would say to me all the time, Doc, do whatever it takes. I don't care what it costs. Well, of course, they didn't have to worry about the costs in those days because it wasn't very much. Today, you often hear families, based on the experience they've been through with their grandparents or parents or relatives, saying, I don't want to end up in a hospital bed with 6 tubes coming out of me for 6 months in a coma. So people are talking about this and thinking about this much more openly than 30 years ago when I was in training. And I think that's a healthy sign. And Atul's book is certainly a very worthwhile book in helping us think about that subject. Yes?
You may be interested to know that Atul's mother is in the audience.
Oh, where are you?
And she's a doctor herself.
Congratulations. He's one of my favorite people. We know each other.
Somebody in the back here.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask
Yes.
a follow-up. I've heard of people having to leave Canada to come to the US.
Sure, people will come if they don't want to wait for a knee replacement.
Or because they were too old, they aged out of, say, a knee replacement.
I don't know the details on that. There may be some truth to that. Honestly, I don't know. And certainly, in every advanced developed country, there are going to be people who will buy special privileges. I'm fine with that, as long as we get basic care to everybody.
The issue of having to wait longer there than here, I think that applies to people like us in this room. I'm not sure that applies to the low-income people in this country who essentially wait basically forever.
Yeah. I guess you're going back here. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. So in many countries, it's been observed too that when there's a strong primary care workforce, physician workforce,
Yes.
there seem to be better outcomes, less costs.
Yes.
In the U.S., it seems to be quite skewed.
Very
What's
skewed.
your take on that, and what can be done to help support primary care physicians?
So most other developed countries have a pretty close to a 50-50 split between primary care and specialties. In this country, I don't know what the exact percents are now, but I'm guessing it's around 75-25, 75% specialty, 25% primary care. And we have to correct that for all kinds of reasons. There are several ways to think about that. One is that in many other developed countries, there's no charge for medical school tuition. People go to medical school free so that when they come out, they don't have this monumental debt that skews their decision-making process towards specialties. You know, there's a saying, some of you may have heard in this country, that medical students today graduate and they want to go on the road. Have you heard that? Yes. Radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, and dermatology. ROAD, because of obvious reasons. So one of the things we could do would be to eliminate or greatly reduce tuition so people don't have debts and can make different kinds of decisions. We also, I think, need to support the growing movement for both NPs and PAs, nurse practitioners and physician assistants, who can do probably 60 to 70%, 75% of what primary care doctors do and do it very well with training. So there are some answers like that, and we have to address it because the imbalance is part of the problem, no question.
Once again, we've been honored by a star performance by Dr. Timothy Johnson. Help me. Thank you.